The conference room lights were too bright for grief. Polished mahogany reflected our faces like a still pond, and I watched mine tremble as Franklin Thompson adjusted his reading glasses. Across the table, Lucas stretched his cufflinks just far enough to flash a platinum watch, while Dominic scrolled his phone under the lip of the table with practiced disinterest. Marianne's pearl earrings barely trembled as she dabbed dry eyes with a black handkerchief, the motion so precise it looked rehearsed. When Franklin began the formal language, "I will now proceed with the last will and testament of James Edward Bennett," someone behind me shifted a leather chair, and the squeak cut through the room like a small guilty confession. My name came last. It always did. After properties and portfolios and a yacht, after cash gifts and heirlooms, a pause landed like a hand on my shoulder. Franklin reached into a folder and produced a thin, yellowed envelope. He walked the length of the table shoes, whispering against carpet, and placed it in my hands. It felt weightless and heavy at the same time. Across from me, Lucas pressed his lips together until they whitened. Dominic's smirk was quick and private, meant only for me. I traced the brittle edge with my thumb, the way you test a cut you're pretending not to feel. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever sat at a table where your name meant less than your blood, hit that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed. There's more to this story than what that envelope seemed to say. But to understand how that morning turned a lifetime into a single stinging moment, you need to know where it began. My name is Crystal Bennett. I teach 3rd grade in a public school north of Boston, a job that smells like washable markers and pencil shavings and late afternoon rain after recess. My classroom has paper suns taped to the window and a crooked bookshelf that leans just enough to make me keep an extra hand on it when the kids gather close. It is the single place where my voice never had to compete with money. It is also the quiet opposite of the house where I grew up. That house sits on a narrow street in Beacon Hill, with iron railings that collect snow like lace in January. Inside, marble floors swallow footsteps, and chandeliers hold a kind of cold light that does not warm even when the fire crackles. My bedroom was tucked under the eaves on the 3rd floor, 2 flights above the rooms where the family lived. Some nights, the stairwell felt like a boundary marker, and I learned young how to move silently around people who loved the idea of family more than they loved its work. Favoritism rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes as small currents that carry a boat so gradually you only realize you've drifted when you look up and see a different shoreline. When Lucas and Dominic were given keys to glossy cars at 16, I received a card with a crisp $20 bill and a signature that did not match the words beneath it. When a photographer came for holiday portraits, I learned which side of the frame was mine. When the boys' grades were mentioned at dinner, the praise arrived like applause. When my acceptance to Harvard came, someone asked the caterer for more ice. I kept my head down and learned to prize the work no one else noticed. I stacked perfect rows of index cards and hawked through worksheets like a runner lunging for the finish when deadlines crept close. The morning the Harvard letter came, I poured orange juice into a glass too quickly and spilled a bright arc across the counter. Marianne's mouth pinched, and she declared the marble stains if you're careless. Later that night, my father tapped my shoulder on the landing and asked what I planned to study with a tone that made education sound like a temporary illness. I told him the truth. I wanted to be in the room where a child realizes that words unlock the world. He blinked as if I'd spoken a language he hadn't used since college. Then he nodded once, neutral as weather, and the conversation ended like a meeting that ran out of minutes on the calendar. Years stacked like ledgers. Lucas and Dominic joined the company with titles that floated to them on soft air. I moved into a small 2-bedroom in Somerville with a finicky radiator and a sink that gurgled at night. My paycheck carried me from month to month steady, if not generous. But the joy of teaching did not need help to pay its own way. There's a hush when a third grader finally hears the pattern inside multiplication, a quiet that lifts the floor under your feet. It's the kind of wealth no one commissions an oil painting for, but I kept collecting it anyway. The last time my father and I had a conversation that felt almost like one was at a Christmas party 2 years ago, the kind where the poinsettias look rented and the shrimp is stacked like a little joke about excess. He had been drinking, which put color in his cheeks and a looseness in his shoulders I didn't recognize at board meetings. He gestured at the ballroom, a sweep of crystal and polished shoes, and said, "All of this could have been yours." I said I already had all I needed. He shook his head as if I'd chosen the wrong door on a game show and walked away before I could ask what the right one would have cost. And then the hospital lights came, and the beeping monitors, and the smell of antiseptic that works its way into your hair, no matter how often you wash it. My father's diagnosis entered our lives like a verdict delivered in a quiet voice. Lucas and Dominic hovered at the edges of the room, whispering about meetings and timelines, the word assets tinny in the fluorescent glow. I brought paperbacks and read to him in a chair that punished the body after the first hour. Sometimes he squeezed my hand. Sometimes his eyes slid over me as if he were already visiting the room's memory keeps locked. When he died, the monitors flattened with the strange politeness of a machine ending a song. I was alone in the room, and there was nothing cinematic about it, just a hand cooling in mine and a nurse who moved with great kindness as she silenced the sound that meant stay. Grief is private and unruly, but the funeral was not. It was a parade of black fabric and careful eyebrows, a cathedral crowded with deals waiting to happen in the courtyard after. I spoke briefly, and my voice broke. People cried in the way they do when sincerity surprises them. Then the limousines hummed, and we drove to the place where families become spreadsheets. Thompson Greenberg and Associates sits high enough to see the harbor, which looked pewter that morning under a deck of low clouds. The reception smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. A junior associate with a perfect bun ushered us into a conference room that felt like a museum display for money. Marianne sat with the posture of a woman who understands seating charts and loves them. Lucas crossed an ankle over a knee and smeared impatience across his face like cologne. Dominic practiced boredom, always his most cultivated expression. Franklin began with condolences and moved quickly to the math. Words like title valuation and portfolio landed in piles, and I recognized the cadence the way a teacher recognizes the rustle of backpacks 5 minutes before the bell. Lucas received the Boston headquarters and 2 other properties numbers that spelled millions, even if you didn't tally them. Dominic gathered the investment portfolio, the yacht, and my father's vintage cars. Marianne accepted the Beacon Hill house as if someone had brought her a coat she'd been wearing all along. Distant relatives got checks with more zeros than any of my friends had seen at once. You can tell a story by what it leaves out. Mine didn't include my name. When Franklin finally reached, and to my daughter Crystal, there was a hitch so soft I might have imagined it. He produced the envelope like a magician tired of his act and walked it to me. The paper felt older than the room the flaps sealed, so carefully the glue had browned along the edge. I did not look at anyone as I took it. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked again, and someone coughed into a fist. My hands stayed still in my lap. I learned long ago that stillness is armor. Lucas leaned across the table just far enough for me to see the bright whiteness of his teeth. "Don't spend it all in one place," he whispered as the room began to rise in small movements of chairs and papers. Dominic added, "Maybe it's a coupon. You love practical things." Marianne's handkerchief paused midair, the performance complete. Outside, rain waited for us like a patient photographer. The elevators released us into the lobby with a sigh, and I kept my gaze on the marble stay lines so I would not see anyone's eyes. In the garage, my Honda sat dependable and plain, a decade of salt on its wheel wells. Inside, I set the envelope on the passenger seat, as if it were a sleeping bird I could not decide to keep or set free. My breath fogged the windshield in a soft cloud until the wipers smeared it away. There's a silence that arrives after humiliation, a soft, humming emptiness that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. I drove home through a slate afternoon, the city blurred by moving water streetlights lifting early like a collective shrug. My building door stuck on damp days. Today, it gave way without a fight. I left my shoes by the mat, set my keys in the chipped bowl on the counter, and put the envelope on the coffee table where the afternoon light found it. The lock clicked behind me with a sound I felt in my ribs. I made tea to have something to do with my hands. The kettle sang. I let it sing a second longer than necessary. Somewhere upstairs, a neighbor laughed too loudly at a joke I couldn't hear. Steam curled from the mug and fogged my glasses, and when I wiped them with the hem of my sleeve, the envelope blurred and cleared again, as if it wanted to be both future and past at once. I sat on the couch and folded my legs under me the way I do when I grade papers careful and small. I could have opened it then. I could have torn the flap and freed whatever small bill or stinging note waited inside. Instead, I touched the edge with one finger and felt the slight give of brittle paper. I thought about the marble floors and the chandeliers that never warmed. I thought about the hospital monitors and the way his hand had grown light in mine, like a boat untying from its dock. I thought about every dinner where I spoke in short sentences, so I would not invite an argument about purpose and profit. The tea went cool before I noticed. Evening folded itself neatly over the windows, and the streetlight outside clicked on with a soft, electrical cough. I turned on the lamp with the peeled shade and watched the circle of light settle on the coffee table. The envelope sat exactly where I had put it, small, tired patient. Somewhere in the building, a pipe clanged like a spoon in an empty pot. I picked it up, weighed it, and set it down again. People think injustice is loud. Sometimes it is a quiet room and a sealed envelope, and the knowledge that the people who share your last name believe theirs matters more. My phone lit with a new text from an unknown number, 2 lines of legalese about a follow-up document, and tomorrow's pickup time for certified copies. I silenced it and let the apartment return to its small, familiar noises. By the time the rain softened to a delicate patter, a decision had gathered itself inside me without words. I reached for the envelope, slid a fingernail under the brittle glue, and paused at the first whisper of it giving way. The room held its breath with me. Then, with the smallest sound, a sigh of paper, a thin seam opening, I stopped, and the flap fell back into place. The night had not finished saying what it needed to say. The envelope sat on my coffee table long after midnight, the small shape outlined by the lamplight like something alive. The rain outside had quieted to a soft drizzle that tapped against the window panes in slow rhythm. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rush of cars along the wet street below. The city sounded distant the way it does when you've been awake too long and your thoughts have gone heavy. When I finally slid my finger under the flap, the glue gave with a sigh. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, cream-colored and worn around the edges. The handwriting stopped me first, my father's neat and deliberate, written with a blue pen he always kept clipped to his shirt pocket. Beneath it was a string of numbers, followed by one short line. This is for the child who was never supposed to exist. I sat there, reading that line again and again, feeling the words settle somewhere deep and unfamiliar. The quiet of the room turned sharp. It wasn't anger, not yet just a hollow kind of ache that pulled at my ribs. I wanted to crumple the page and throw it away to be done with all the ways he'd managed to make me feel invisible even now. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. I turned on my laptop and typed the name of the Swiss bank printed across the top of the paper. The website loaded in English, a clean page of navy and white that asked for an account number and an identification code. My hands trembled as I entered the numbers, trying combinations of passwords that failed again and again until on impulse I typed my mother's birth date. The screen flickered once before filling with numbers that didn't make sense. I blinked, thinking I'd misread them. Then I realized the decimal was in the wrong place. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. 25,786,412.09. I covered my mouth with both hands, unable to breathe for a moment. For years, I'd been the afterthought, the outsider, the quiet teacher in a family that measured worth by the square footage of a property deed. Now the truth was staring back from a glowing screen. My father's final gesture wasn't neglect, it was protection. The shock rolled through me so completely that I barely noticed the small envelope still lying open on the table. When I turned it upside down, a second paper slipped out, sealed with dark red wax. I broke it carefully, afraid it might crumble, and unfolded a letter written in that same steady blue ink. "My dearest Crystal," it began. The words blurred as I started to read. He told me things I'd never known about my mother, that she'd been his college sweetheart, his tutor, the only woman who believed in his better self. That her family had been poor and proud, the kind of people his father disapproved of. He wrote about their secret marriage, their promise to build a life that didn't revolve around money, and how that promise broke under the weight of his ambition. I read about her illness, the complications during my birth, and his grief that turned into shame. Marianne's name appeared then, a single thread running through the rest of the story, how she'd offered him a lifeline for his career, but only if he kept me at the edges of the family. And he had agreed. The letter didn't justify it, but it admitted the truth. Every exclusion, every quiet correction at the dinner table had been part of an arrangement I was never supposed to understand. By the time I reached the end, tears had soaked through the edges of the paper. He'd written that he had been building a fund for me since the day I was born, setting aside pieces of each deal, pretending they were consulting fees. He wrote that Lucas and Dominic had been stealing from the company for years, and that he'd hired a private investigator, a man named Daniel Walsh, to gather evidence. My father had planned everything, the misdirection at the will reading the secrecy, even the phrase that had hurt me so deeply. For the child who was never supposed to exist. It was his way of saying that I had survived every plan meant to erase me. Tucked inside the letter was a flash drive and a business card for Daniel Walsh Investigations. A handwritten note below said, "Call anytime. I've been waiting for your call for years." The room felt smaller, somehow filled with the sound of my heartbeat. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the streetlights reflected in puddles like scattered coins. I sat on the couch until the sky began to lighten, rereading the letter, tracing each word with my thumb, as though I could feel his voice in the ink. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not by the father who'd ignored me, but by the man who had finally confessed the truth. When morning came, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stared at my phone. Calling a stranger about something this big felt impossible, but the card sat on the table patient as a promise. I dialed the number before I could lose my nerve. The line clicked after the second ring. "Miss Bennett," a calm male voice said. "I've been expecting your call." I hesitated. "You knew my father? I worked for him," he replied. "For a long time. He told me you'd call after the will." His voice carried the ease of someone who had spent his life solving other people's secrets. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a cafe in Cambridge, quiet and out of the way. The hours between felt endless. I graded a few papers just to keep my hands busy, circling misspelled words and smiley faces while my thoughts spun like leaves in a gust of wind. When I arrived, Daniel Walsh was already there, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp, alert eyes. He stood as I approached, his handshake firm, his expression kind but cautious. "You look like your mother," he said, almost under his breath. We sat near the window, the late sun slanting across the table. Over the next 2 hours, he told me what he and my father had uncovered. Shell companies, falsified invoices, bank transfers, buried in layers of false names. Lucas and Dominic had stolen millions using my father's empire like their personal vault. Marianne had known, of course. In some cases, she'd helped. My stomach turned as I listened, not from shock, but from recognition. It fit too easily. Every time I'd watched them whisper after family dinners, every time I'd seen Marianne shield them from even mild criticism, it had been part of something larger, colder. Walsh slid a folder across the table. "Your father made sure this would all be yours. Every document, every recording. The board of directors already has instructions for the transfer of control. The company belongs to you now." I stared at him, unsure I'd heard correctly. "To me?" He nodded. He filed the papers months before he passed. He wanted to protect it from them. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The empire that had once made me feel so small was suddenly mine, handed down by a man who'd only just learned how to love me in the last months of his life. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing my father's handwriting in my mind, the way the ink looped around the words with love and regret. I thought about calling Lucas, about telling him everything, but the memory of his smirk at the will reading stopped me. By Sunday evening, the decision was made for me. A furious pounding shook my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw them both, Lucas, red-faced, Dominic right behind him. When I opened the door, Lucas pushed past me, his voice already raised. "You think you're clever," Zurich called. "You think we wouldn't find out?" Dominic gave a low whistle as he looked around my apartment. "Hard to believe someone with 25 million lives like this." I folded my arms and waited. "Why are you here?" "You stole it," Lucas said, his finger jabbing the air. "You manipulated Dad into changing everything." "The money is legally mine," I said quietly, "and so is the company." The room went still. For a second, even Lucas didn't seem to understand the words. Dominic was the first to recover. "That's ridiculous," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "You don't know how to run a company. You teach third graders." "I do know integrity," I replied. "Something neither of you learned." Lucas stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can destroy us?" I met his gaze without blinking. "I don't have to destroy anything. You did that yourselves." He moved toward me, but I held up my phone. "Every conversation is being recorded," I said, "and Daniel Walsh has copies of everything you've done. Leave now." They hesitated just long enough for me to see the fear flicker beneath their outrage. Then they turned, slamming the door behind them hard enough to rattle the picture frames. When the sound finally died away, I sank onto the couch and pressed my palms together, trying to steady my breathing. The adrenaline left me shaky, but beneath it was something stronger resolve. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was protecting myself. That night, I sent a message to Barbara Holden, the attorney named in my father's letter, confirming an appointment for the next morning. I backed up every file from the flash drive and placed the originals in a locked box. The envelope, The letter, even the card from Daniel, all of it went into the safe. Through the window, the city lights shimmered against a sky that had cleared to pale gray. I thought of my mother, then the teacher in the old photograph, smiling beside a chalkboard. She had never lived to see what her daughter would become, but somehow, through everything, I felt her presence in the stillness. When I finally turned out the lamp, I whispered a promise into the dark. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The girl who once sat at the edge of the family table was gone. In her place was someone new, someone no longer waiting for permission to exist. The morning air in Boston carried that thin chill that settles in just before winter, the kind that makes breath visible and thoughts sharper. I left my apartment early, the city half awake, and walked the few blocks to the law offices downtown. My bag was heavier than usual. Inside were copies of my father's documents, the flash drive, and a heart that hadn't stopped pounding since the night my brothers appeared at my door. Barbara Holden's office occupied a quiet corner of a historic building near Copley Square. The receptionist greeted me softly, as though she already knew why I was there. Moments later, Barbara stepped into the waiting area, tall and steady gray hair, gathered into a neat twist. She extended her hand with the calm of someone who had spent decades sorting through the wreckage of powerful families. "Crystal," she said, her voice low and kind, "your father spoke very highly of you." Her office was lined with books and framed degrees, but there was nothing cold about it. A porcelain cup of tea waited on the desk beside a single lamp that gave off a golden glow. I sat across from her as she opened the folder I'd brought. For a long while, the only sound was the turning of pages. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharp but not unkind. "You understand the gravity of what this represents," she said. "You have legal control over Bennett Real Estate Holdings. Every major asset, every subsidiary, all protected under the trust your father created." I nodded slowly, though the words felt unreal. "I don't want revenge," I said quietly. "I just want to make things right." Barbara leaned back slightly, studying me. "Then we'll do this carefully. Truth has a way of defending itself when given time and proper documentation." We spent the next hour reviewing the strategy my father had left behind: corporate transfers, recorded statements, medical evaluations confirming his sound mind. It felt clinical, almost detached, until Barbara slid a stack of legal filings toward me. "They're already challenging you," she said. "Your brothers have filed a petition contesting the will. We'll respond by morning." The paper smelled faintly of toner and dust. For a moment, I stared at the black type, remembering Lucas's sneer, Dominic's smooth denial, and Marianne's steady silence over the years. I signed where she indicated each stroke of the pen, both trembling and sure. Outside, the sunlight had broken through the gray clouds pooling on the wet sidewalk. I stood there for a long minute before walking to the cafe across the street. My coffee grew cold as I replayed Barbara's final words. "Once we file, the truth becomes public." It didn't take long. Within days, the first articles appeared, headlines clipped and formal: "Bennett family estate faces legal dispute." Reporters called the school where I taught, then my apartment. I ignored them all. The real storm arrived the following week when I walked into the courthouse and found Marianne waiting with her sons. She was dressed for theater, black coat, pearls, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Lucas paced near the benches, jaw tight, while Dominic scrolled his phone as though none of it mattered. Their attorney, a man with the polished air of old money, approached Barbara with a practiced smile. The hearing room smelled faintly of varnish and old carpet. The judge, a middle-aged woman with patient eyes, asked for opening statements. Their side went first. The lawyer spoke of confusion, declining health, manipulation by an estranged daughter. He painted me as an opportunist who had taken advantage of a dying man. When Barbara stood, the rhythm of the room changed. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and edged with quiet certainty. She spoke of planning of clear legal transfers of independent evaluations. Then she pressed play on a recording. My father's voice filled the room steady, despite the faint rasp of illness. "I have made these decisions freely," he said. "My daughter Crystal will inherit both the company and the responsibility to protect its integrity." The sound of his voice hit me like a wave. For the first time, I heard affection beneath the formality, measured yes, but unmistakable. Across the table, Lucas's face hardened, and Marianne's hand twitched toward her pearls. Barbara continued producing financial statements and signed memorandums. Each page landed with the quiet weight of proof. When she mentioned the embezzlement investigation, the lawyer on the other side began to object, but the judge allowed her to finish. "We have extensive documentation," Barbara said. "Funds diverted from corporate accounts into shell companies linked to the respondents. The evidence is already in the hands of federal authorities." For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. Dominic looked at his mother, eyes wide. Lucas's knuckles turned white around the edge of the table. That silence didn't last. Their attorney demanded to see the evidence claimed fabrication, questioned the authenticity of the documents. The judge asked for patience, then called for a recess. Outside in the hallway, the tension felt thick enough to touch. Lucas approached me first. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "You think this makes you a hero? You're destroying everything Dad built." I met his eyes. "No, you did that when you stole from it." Dominic tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked halfway through. "You don't know what you're doing, Crystal. You can't handle this world. I'm handling it just fine," I said. "You'll have to start learning how to tell the truth." Barbara touched my arm lightly, signaling it was time to go. The courthouse doors opened onto a gust of cold wind that cut through my coat, but it felt cleaner outside than in. We stood at the top of the steps as reporters called questions, cameras clicking like distant rain. Barbara's driver pulled up to the curb, and she opened the door for me. "Go home," she said. "Let the process work. Tomorrow will bring movement." She was right. The next morning, a message from Daniel Walsh waited on my phone. "Federal inquiry confirmed. SEC reviewing documentation." Those words should have felt like victory, but they only brought a deep, tired sadness. Justice doesn't erase what came before, it only sets it in order. That evening, I drove to the harbor and parked near the water. The wind carried salt and the faint cry of gulls. I sat in the car watching the lights from the city ripple across the dark surface. My father had loved this view. I remembered being a child in the back seat while he took business calls, the skyline reflected in the window beside me. He'd always been looking forward, never sideways. Now, for the first time, I felt the horizon tilt in my favor. Not because I'd won, but because I had finally stopped shrinking. A week later, the final hearing began. This time, the courtroom was full of reporters, board members, curious observers. The sound of papers shuffling echoed off the high ceiling. Marianne took the stand, her voice soft, almost trembling. She spoke of loyalty, of misunderstanding, of a family torn apart by greed. Her words floated through the room like perfume designed to linger without substance. When Barbara cross-examined her, the mask cracked. She presented emails, private exchanges between Marianne and her sons, discussing ways to hide transactions and avoid detection. Each message was projected on the courtroom screen, each line a quiet betrayal written in their own words. Lucas muttered something under his breath. Dominic stared at the table. The judge called for order, but the damage was already done. Then Daniel Walsh took the stand. His testimony was meticulous, grounded in records and timelines. He described wire transfers, altered invoices, and meetings secretly recorded. At one point, he turned toward me and nodded slightly as if to say, "It's done." When the judge finally spoke, her ruling was clear. The challenge to the will was denied. Control of Bennett Real Estate Holdings remained with me. The court recognized my father's mental competence and confirmed the authenticity of every document. The sound of the gavel felt heavier than it should have. Marianne sat still, eyes glassy. Lucas exhaled through his teeth, fury twisting his face. Dominic whispered something to the attorney, then looked down. Shoulders slumped. Barbara gathered the papers and handed me a copy of the final order. "It's over," she said softly. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon light. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and wet stone. For the first time in months, the tightness in my chest began to ease. I hadn't smiled in a long while, but as I looked toward the sky, a quiet calm settled over me. The headlines that followed were louder than I'd expected. Bennett Empire in turmoil, daughter takes control amid fraud investigation. I stopped reading them after a day or two. The story belonged to the public now, but the meaning was mine alone. In the evenings, I returned to my classroom tidying books and planning lessons. The children didn't know or care about the chaos outside. They cared about spelling lists and science experiments about who got to feed the class fish that week. Their laughter grounded me more than any courtroom ever could. A few weeks later, I received a call from Barbara. The federal investigations had concluded Lucas was charged with multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. Dominic had entered a plea deal. Marianne faced civil penalties and the quiet exile that comes when money no longer shields reputation. I thanked her, then sat for a long time in silence. Justice had a strange sound. It wasn't applause or relief. It was the hum of the radiator, the ticking of the kitchen clock, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. That night, I opened the old envelope again and unfolded my father's letter. The paper was softer now, worn at the creases. I traced his words, feeling the ghost of his pen through the fibers. He had given me wealth, yes, but also something rarer. Truth, hard-earned and complicated. When I set the letter down, the city outside was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. I turned off the light, and in the darkness, I felt it clearly for the first time, not triumph, but balance. The scales that had been tilted since childhood were finally level. Tomorrow, I told myself, would begin something entirely different. Winter arrived quietly that year, coating Boston in a thin layer of frost that glittered under streetlights. The days had grown shorter, but inside my small apartment, the world felt unexpectedly wider. The legal war was over. The headlines had faded. Yet instead of celebration, I felt something closer to stillness, like standing at the edge of an unfamiliar shore, waiting for the tide to decide which way it would pull. I still taught my third graders every morning. The smell of chalk dust and dry erase markers greeted me as I walked into the classroom, the same as always. They didn't know that the company I now owned stretched across several states, or that their teacher had been on the front page of the Boston Globe. They only cared that we had a spelling quiz on Friday and that snow might cancel school. Their laughter softened the noise that success had brought, and I clung to that quiet balance between the life I'd built and the legacy I'd inherited. At night, when the building settled into silence, I began the process of cleaning my father's estate, his papers, his properties, and all the things that once symbolized a family I could never quite enter. The Beacon Hill mansion was first. I walked through its grand rooms in late January, the air cold even with the heat running. Chandeliers still glowed, paintings hung perfectly aligned, and yet every corner echoed with the hollowness of pretense. I paused at the staircase where I used to sit as a child, listening to laughter from rooms where I was never invited. It looked smaller now. The real estate agent met me in the foyer, her heels clicking across the marble. "It's a remarkable property," she said softly, her breath visible in the chill. "But I can tell it doesn't feel like home to you." She was right. I told her to proceed with the sale with one condition: the proceeds would go directly to charity. Half to the Sarah Bennett Educational Foundation I had established, and half to cancer research in my father's name. Let the building that had once divided a family help rebuild someone else's life. Clearing the mansion felt like shedding old skin. Boxes of photographs, family silver ledgers, and antique clocks, each one cataloged and sent away. I kept only a few things: my grandmother's pearl earrings, a single photograph of my father and mother in their 20s, and his worn copy of The Great Gatsby. That book had followed me through childhood, always visible on his desk, yet never once opened in my presence. I found his handwritten notes in the margins, quiet reflections on ambition and regret. It struck me how much he had hidden behind those pages, how much he'd known about the price of wanting too much. One evening, as I left the mansion for the last time, I stood on the front steps and looked up at the windows glowing against the night. I didn't feel anger anymore, only gratitude for what I'd survived. The past had built its walls, but I had learned how to walk beyond them. Marianne appeared at my office a few weeks later. I had expected the call. Eventually, her signature on the security desk log felt almost inevitable. She wore black again, as if mourning the life she'd lost, though the diamonds at her wrist still caught the light. Her voice was gentle, practiced. "Crystal, dear, you've become quite impressive. I always knew you had potential." The word "dear" landed like a ghost from another life. She spoke of family unity, of forgiveness, of the way appearances mattered in Boston society. When she finally admitted her true reason for visiting, that her funds were tied up, that her accounts were frozen pending litigation, I saw the thin crack of desperation behind her poise. "I can't access anything," she said. "Not even the Martha's Vineyard property. I thought perhaps you might help me until it's sorted." I studied her carefully, the way one examines a reflection to see if it's real. "The court determined what's fair," I said quietly. "You'll receive what you're owed. Nothing more, nothing less." Her smile faltered, but she nodded as though she'd expected it. "You're your father's daughter after all." For the first time, I met that remark without pain. "I am," I said, "but not the part you remember." She stood smoothing the sleeve of her coat. "I hope you'll reconsider," she murmured. "The past doesn't have to stay cold." As the door closed behind her, the scent of her expensive perfume lingered for a moment, then faded into nothing. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling the air I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something I owed her. It was something I owed myself. The months that followed unfolded with quiet steadiness. I worked with Barbara and Daniel to restructure the company, removing the excess that had fueled so much greed. I met with department heads, listened more than I spoke, and rebuilt trust where fear had taken root. The boardroom that once intimidated me now felt like neutral ground. I wasn't trying to prove myself anymore. I was simply doing what needed to be done. At home, I found small rituals of peace, lighting a candle at dusk, writing lesson plans by hand, keeping my mother's photograph on the windowsill. On weekends, I began to meet people connected to her past. Daniel helped track them down: her old college roommate, a former colleague, even one of her students now grown and teaching in Vermont. Each meeting gave me a new glimpse of the woman I had never known. She had painted watercolors in her spare time, taught adults to read after long days at school, and laughed easily often. I learned that she had loved small things lilacs in the spring, handwritten letters, the sound of rain on a tin roof. Every detail built a bridge between us, and in that connection I found a calm I hadn't known I was missing. By spring, the foundation had begun awarding its first scholarships. The letters from students came on thin paper, filled with gratitude and nervous handwriting. Some spoke of dreams that reminded me of my own teaching service creation. Others simply thanked me for believing in them. I kept those letters in a box by my desk, each one a quiet reminder that good can grow from ruin if tended carefully. Still, there were nights when memories returned. I'd dream of my father sitting at his desk, light from the window falling across his face, his expression unreadable. I'd wake wondering what he might say if he could see me now. There was no way to know, but I chose to believe he would have been proud not of the wealth, but of the peace that came after. In late April, Barbara invited me to a small dinner with members of the cancer research team that the foundation supported. It was held in a modest restaurant near the harbor, nothing like the galas my family once hosted. Over wine and simple food, people shared stories of survivors of breakthroughs, of quiet victories that never made the news. I realized then how differently my life had come to measure value, not in profit or acclaim, but in the number of people whose lives grew lighter because of something I could offer. On my way home that night, the city lights shimmered across the Charles River. I pulled over near the same spot where I'd parked months earlier, when everything had still been uncertain. The wind carried a hint of warmth, now the season turning. I thought about the girl I'd been then, frightened, angry, unsure where she belonged. I wished I could tell her what I knew now that the things meant to break us often carve out the space where grace can finally grow. One afternoon, near the end of the school year, I received a letter from the warden's office. Lucas had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Dominic's plea deal had reduced his sentence to 18 months. There was no joy in reading it, only finality. They had built their own walls, and I would not climb over them again. Marianne sent one more message through her attorney, a note written in her familiar looping script. It spoke of regret, of misunderstanding, of a wish for reconciliation. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same box that held my father's letter. Some things don't need an answer. Time will do the talking. As summer began, I took a week off and drove north to Vermont. My Aunt Patricia had kept a small lakeside cottage there, one I hadn't visited since childhood. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. I spent the evening sitting on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass and fade into the dark. The stillness wrapped around me like something familiar at last. One night, I opened my laptop and drafted a new mission statement for the foundation. The first line came easily: to honor the quiet strength of those who teach us what love should look like. It felt like a dedication to both of my parents, the woman who had believed in education and the man who had finally found courage to tell the truth. The lake lay calm beneath the moon, a sheet of silver shifting with the wind. I thought of the children whose lives might change because of those scholarships, of the families who might find comfort through the research fund, of all the ways legacy can become something gentler than inheritance. When I finally went inside, I turned off the light and watched my reflection disappear in the window. The silence was deep and kind. For the first time, I understood that peace wasn't the absence of pain. It was what remained when you stopped letting pain decide who you were. Outside, the night carried the faint sound of water against the dock, steady as breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the lake. The sound lingered, then faded into quiet, and I closed my eyes, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The summer nights grew long that year, stretching past what felt like reason, the sun lingering low over the horizon, before giving in to darkness. I spent most evenings on the porch of the Vermont cottage, listening to the rhythm of the lake and the soft rustle of leaves. There was peace in that stillness, a kind that didn't need to be earned anymore, only noticed. One morning, I woke before dawn to the sound of birds breaking the silence. Mist hung low over the water, pale and blue, and the world felt suspended between night and day. I carried my coffee outside the mug warm in my hands and sat watching as light began to bloom across the lake. Each ripple caught the sun like threads of gold. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. The weeks following the trial had been heavy with decisions, but in Vermont, I let myself slow down. I still taught when school resumed that fall, still met with the foundation board, still read bedtime stories to my students with the same steady voice. Yet everything I did carried a quiet intention now. It was as if the noise of ambition, the one that had ruled my family for generations, had finally gone silent, leaving room for something gentler. Sometimes I'd drive into the nearby town for groceries or walk along the farmer's market with a woven bag over my shoulder. People would smile, nod politely, and not a single one of them knew my last name meant anything beyond a simple introduction. I found comfort in that anonymity. It reminded me that legacy didn't need to be loud to matter. Every Friday evening, I wrote letters, some I sent, others I didn't. One went to the warden overseeing Lucas's facility, authorizing donations for educational programs there. I didn't tell him it came from me, but I hoped he might find the patience to learn something new behind those walls. Dominic wrote once a short letter asking for forgiveness in careful formal handwriting. I replied that he didn't need my forgiveness, just the courage to become someone better. Marianne's silence continued. I'd hear her name occasionally through legal updates, selling jewelry, moving to a smaller apartment, keeping mostly to herself. I didn't wish her ill. In truth, I rarely thought of her at all anymore. She had built her world on reputation, and once it cracked, there was nothing left to stand on. When the new academic year began, the foundation awarded its first round of full scholarships. 20 children from across Massachusetts, bright-eyed, uncertain, and overflowing with possibility, stood together in a small ceremony at the library downtown. Their parents took photos, their laughter echoing through the marble hall. I gave a short speech, my voice steady, though my heart trembled a little. I spoke about my mother, about how she believed education was the quietest form of hope. I told them that knowledge didn't belong to privilege. It belonged to effort, to kindness, to the courage of ordinary people who refused to stop learning. When I finished, a young girl with auburn hair came up to me clutching her scholarship folder. "I want to be a teacher too," she said shyly. Her smile held the same spark I used to feel when I thought the world might listen. Later that night, after the building emptied, I stayed behind and walked through the rows of books. The scent of paper and old wood hung in the air. My footsteps echoed softly. I thought of my father, then not as the man who had hurt me, but as the one who had finally tried to set things right. In his own flawed human way, he had left me the means to choose what kind of life I wanted. That I realized was the truest inheritance of all. Autumn arrived quietly. The lake near the cottage mirrored the trees in shades of gold and crimson. On weekends, I drove up to help Aunt Patricia repair the old boathouse, our hands cold from the wind, our laughter echoing against the water. She spoke gently about my father, about the younger brother she remembered before ambition hardened him. Her stories didn't erase what had happened, but they added something softer around it, a sense that even the people who fail us are capable of moments worth remembering. In November, Daniel Walsh stopped by the cottage on his way through town. He looked the same as ever, silver hair, neatly combed eyes, alert and kind. We sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the sky streaked with pale pink light. "He would be proud of you," Daniel said quietly. I didn't answer right away. The word proud used to sting, but now it felt lighter. Maybe, I said, but I think I'm finally proud of me, and that's enough. He smiled at that, and for a while we didn't speak. The wind carried the scent of pine, the sound of geese overhead, marking the change of season. Before he left, he placed a small envelope on the porch rail. A few last documents, he said. Mostly closure. Inside were photographs my father had kept pictures of me at various ages taken from a distance. School plays, graduations, small moments I never knew he'd been there for. One photo showed me at 8 years old standing on a playground in Vermont, hair tangled by the wind. In the background, just beyond the fence, I could see him in his gray coat watching quietly. That night, I placed the photos beside my mother's picture on the windowsill. For years, I had mourned the family I wished for. Now, I honored the truth of the one I had. Imperfect, broken, but real. By winter, snow had covered the lake, a smooth sheet of white, stretching to the horizon. I often walked to the dock just to listen, the world hushed under layers of frost and air, so cold it burned. Standing there, breath clouding before me, I thought about everything that had led here. The mansion, the trial, the letter that changed my life. All of it now felt like a story I'd read a long time ago. The ending didn't hurt anymore. On the first day of spring, I returned to Boston to finalize a few last company matters. The board had fully transitioned leadership, and I'd decided to step back, remaining only as chair for the foundation. It wasn't loss, it was completion. I no longer needed to control the empire that had once defined my father. My legacy would live in classrooms, not skyscrapers. As I left the office for the last time, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, warming the polished floors. I paused in the doorway and let it touch my face. The air smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish, familiar yet distant. Behind me, the city hummed with life, unaware of the quiet victory taking place in a single heartbeat. That evening back at the cottage, I lit a candle near the window and watched dusk fold over the water. The reflection trembled in the glass, soft and gold. I thought of my students, of the children who would grow up under the foundation's care of every small ripple that had begun from a single dusty envelope. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It crept in gently like sunlight after rain, filling the corners that once held grief. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about choosing to stop carrying what no longer belonged to me. As night deepened, I closed my journal and listened to the faint chorus of frogs along the shore. The air was cool, fragrant with pine and wet earth. A single star appeared above the lake, steady and unhurried. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive, they fade because we finally let go. That's how peace finds you quietly, without announcement, and long after you stop looking for it. If this story touched you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe that strength can live in silence as much as in triumph, share this story with someone who understands. Thank you for listening and for keeping the light alive, even in the calmest hours of dusk.